Welcome to chapter 13. How to stop reforming. How to stop reforming. So, who has the authority to say, enough is enough? What we're going to look at is, we're going to see the baton, those who took the baton of Reformation onwards, and a little bit of how the Reformation came to England. We're going to start off with Melanchthon. Melanchthon. I know it says oh, there should be a CH in there. Should be a CH in there. Okay, just bear with me. C-H-T-H-O-N. Melanchthon. But it's pronounced Melanchthon. And you just have to trust me on that one. I don't know how to pronounce many of these. Melanchthon, in my notes, I refer to him as the conciliatory. Melanchthon the conciliatory. Because he is the good egg who tries to work out ways in which Lutheranism can settle down. We have the Augsburg Confession with these simple ways of laying it out. This is what we're going to be like. This is who we are. Melanchthon tries to sort of form this in. If you're writing a Reformation essay, your Augsburg Confession of 1530, that would be a useful original source to be looking to. Perhaps the downside of Melanchthon is that he was willing to concede in many areas of doctrine to the Roman Catholics for the sake of peace. Can we not find a way in which the whole church can be reformed? Why do we have to break away? Why can't we all be reformed in this way? But no, not going to happen. Now, there's a guy called Zwingli, Huldrych Zwingli, and he is the Swiss reformer, independent of Luther, apparently. Independent of Luther, he develops his evangelical beliefs, and it starts, the catalyst for this is Lent, and one of those Lent lunches where he goes and somebody serves up sausage and gets in trouble for it because everybody knows you don't eat sausage at Lent, it's ridiculous, and he finds himself in court and over this sausage, and he argues that the Bible doesn't say we should not eat meat during Lent. Christians are free to fast or not to fast because the Bible does not prohibit the eating of meat during Lent. So, Zwingli had a much more memorial approach. Luther still happy with his transubstantiation when it came to looking at communion. But Zwingli, no. When we look at communion, we're looking at a memorial of Jesus. We're not interested in the real presence. Zwingli. Calvin the tulip. Here you are, I've got a tulip here. In a way, Calvin doesn't deserve the tulip, it's Beza who deserves the tulip. Calvin grows up in France, he has a sudden conversion, he writes the institution of the Christian religion, the institutes, they remain well read and well known and well published, and he enjoys just being left alone, but he eventually ends up in Geneva and he helps to bring about a Reformation there and a Reformation, a reformed town. He only recognises the two sacraments, and he establishes this church as supreme and not subject to the state if it's to be the true church. Now, in the process of all this, there's a bloke called Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus is on the run from the Inquisition because he's denied the Trinity. So he's come to Geneva to escape the Catholics and be free. And so he's thinking that perhaps in Calvin's Geneva he'll be safe. It's an interesting test of the city. And what happens is that Michael Servetus is tried and burned by the Genevans. Now, there's a guy who follows Calvin called Theodore Beza, and it's Beza who takes a hold of the idea of predestination, and he takes it through to a further conclusion to do with double predestination. So some of you are predestined for heaven. Well, that just means obviously that some of you are predestined for hell. Well, then who did Christ die for? Well, Christ didn't die for the people who were predestined for hell, so he only died for the people predestined for heaven. And others looked at that and went, well, we're not happy with that. We think Jesus died for everybody. And so this is where your Jacob Arminius spoke out, and he argues that God foresaw those who would freely accept his gift of grace. So Christ died for all, and God knew who would choose. It's probably best shown in Venn diagrams or something. Beza had this idea of, and this is where we get our tulip from. Okay, so tulip, total, each letter, T-U-L-I-P. Tulip, total depravity, we are enslaved to sin. U, unconditional election, God chose from eternity. L, limited atonement, Christ died only for those who are chosen for heaven. Irresistible grace, God's grace overcomes the chosen people's reluctance. And perseverance of the saints, you can't give up being a Christian, God won't let you. That's the good old phrase, once Christian, always Christian phrase. So there you are, memorialized in this idea of the tulip. Now, so there you are, you've had Melanchthon, you've had Zwingli, and you've had Calvin. And so the Reformation just keeps, that's why my symbol of the Reformation tends to be ball of string, because it just keeps going, it just keeps unraveling, and it's no longer a ball, it's now, who knows what it is. And so next we have the Anabaptists. Now you have to be really careful here, because the Anabaptists are not a label. There isn't a group of Anabaptists in the way that there is a group of Calvinists, Zwingli, Lutherans. There isn't. Those people could have gatherings and groupings of people. Anabaptists is a collective noun for all sorts of people that don't quite fit into this category. And the key issue there for them is, with Luther, he kept the princes on his side. Calvin set up his own government to rule. Zwingli worked to win over councils. But what if it can't be done with waiting? What if you just want to, with working with the system, what if you just want to give up and start your own thing differently? And this is where we have the Anabaptists. They don't have all together in common, but they've got certain things in common. They all rejected infant baptism and practiced the baptism of adults on the profession of their own faith. And so this is why lots of councils viewed them as being a bit like the Donatists, a breakaway movement. And so this is why the councils were not at all problematic in persecuting Anabaptists. Not a problem for them. Including the likes of Zwingli, very happy persecuting the Anabaptists. Now, one of the key aspects here is that the Anabaptists recognized, they resisted the idea that Christendom simply meant that everyone was a Christian. And so they began to set about converting Europe. And so from here we have the Moravians, an excellent example of Anabaptists. And if you look up a website, bruderhof.com, you'll read about the importance of loving your neighbour, of sharing everything, pooling income, talents, energy, taking care of one another. We believe that God wants to transform our world here and now. And this needs a life of discipleship and sacrificial commitment. Amen to that. So, the Moravians are doing well, they're alive and well still today. Everybody has this dumb moment in their history, and here it is in 1534 in Munster, where some leaders got some new revelations telling them that it was okay for them to have multiple wives, as the patriarchs did of the Old Testament. And so off they go. And at one level it's quite witty, but if you read a bit more you realise it's actually pretty horrific. And this is really much nearer to a terrorist taking over a town in terms of what it proceeds to descend down to. It gets very nasty very quickly. Okay, let's pause on European Reformation and have a little trip over the Channel and see what's going on in England. Here we find Henry VIII, and he needs an heir. and he needs the heir to be a boy, really. So he gets the bishops to reread their Bibles in a way that might enable him to have a divorce. And that's where this is all headed. But the English seem to be kind of okay about it to a large extent. We don't see the troubles and strife that we see in Europe happening in England. Maybe to some extent this is all part of how people viewed the church as being all about money and plurality, where you hold a couple of churches together. I get to be vicar of 2 churches, and so I get to be paid twice. Those of you signing up to be vicars today will discover that is not what we mean nowadays by plurality. Plurality means you get 1 stipend and we're going to give you 12 churches. Good luck with that. But in medieval times, Henry VIII's times, if you were looking after 2 churches, you got 2 bunches of income, which was great because you could employ some lackey to look after this one. You probably employ some lackey to look after this one, then you can live it up elsewhere. This problem of plurality will continue for quite some centuries, but alas, not for us. Tithes and additional. So you've got big issues to do with money and clergy, immorality and clergy, and state power. See, the thing is that a lot of clergy were actually quite well educated. I know that a few episodes ago we talked about how badly clergy were educated, hence the rise of the Dominicans, of the watchdogs of God, and the sliding slope into Inquisition. But around the time of the establishment of universities, you get a better quality of priest and a more educated priest, and these are the monks who can read and write and they know stuff, and because of that, they're well positioned to take up places of government and authority. So you find all these churchmen running the country in different ways. And to some extent this state power being held by church people was beginning to rancor with the people. And you've got this confusion over loyalty, because you as a bishop pay your taxes to the Pope and not to the crown. And how does that work out? Who are you really loyal to? There's an immoral problem, which I pad out a little bit more on page 6 of 39, if that's how your handout looks. And that'll do. So we move on to Henry VIII, and we see his wedding with Catherine of Aragon. And got to say that pastorally, all this is really quite sad. Yes, we enjoy the politics and the TV shows that get made of all this, but if you're sitting there as a pastor seeing this love that gets broken and hurt, and the relationships that go on in this, it's really tricky. And if you're looking at it from a Bible perspective, there's a lot of use made of Leviticus 20 verse 21. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. And this gets used again and again as justification for why Henry VIII should be allowed to divorce Catherine of Aragon, because he's taken his brother's wife. What I get confused about is why they don't then apply Deuteronomy 25 verse 5, when brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. The husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage. So why was that not an acceptable text as a riposte to the Levitical text? There you go. Now, there's a call for divorce. The Pope prevaricates. Henry VIII gets on with reforming the monasteries as he explores who the monasteries are really loyal to, the Pope or the King. Who are they paying taxes to? And in the midst of all this, you've got Anne Boleyn. And Thomas Cranmer, who finds himself Archbishop, he has this peculiar pressure put upon him to marry Anne Boleyn to Henry VIII before the divorce has come through. And so there's this awkwardness going on there. Be of good cheer. Luther himself had the same pressure put on him, so that he actually does marry I can't remember who it is, to another, and so creates a bigamy situation, and he gets a lot of flack for that. Oh, and we didn't talk about Luther and his later anti-Semitism. I just think I'm just going to throw that out there as a one-liner, and maybe in our seminars we might pick up on that. Yeah, I think that's just worth a one-liner. Meanwhile, Cranmer goes on a European tour to talk to the other churches to go, how are you working out this Reformation? How does it work out for you? In the process of which he comes across Marguerite, and he marries her, and he comes back with her as a secret bride. The story is told that he would put her in a special box, and that box would be strapped to the back of his chariot. What am I trying to say? His wheels, and as it would be taken from house to house as he would go and visit different people, and then the box would be carried in, and out would come Margaret. Gosh, she must have really loved him to have put up with that kind of travelling. A whole different idea to the concept of a backseat driver going on there. So, this is Cranmer. This is some of his issues that he's having to deal with. We see over this period from 1536, legislation was set in train which over the next 60 years led to the transference of a quarter of the total land of England being transferred from the church to the laity. A lot of it to the crown, let's say. Now, in the back of your BCP, you will find the 39 articles. We're not ready for them just yet, but here we start in 1536 with the 10 articles of religion. 1537, permission is given for an English Bible to be produced. Yay, victory for the reformers. This is swings as things go back and forth, because Stephen Gardiner is coming from more of a Catholic perspective, and he gains favour with Henry VIII, resulting in not so much 10 articles but now 6 articles, and a return to a more Catholic doctrine. Yes to transubstantiation, yes to the importance of personal confession, and yes to clergy celibacy. Clergy marriage ruled out. Bit of an awkward problem here for Cranmer and Margaret, who's a bit of an open secret by this stage. I will see you shortly as we come to our next session and we look at a bit more of the English Reformation.